Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources.
Welcome. This is another installment in the Enforcement and Litigation Committee's 2025 podcast series on emerging contaminants. Other episodes in the series cover topics such as microplastics, pharmaceuticals and personal care products, supply chain issues, and ethylene oxide. Let me go ahead and introduce our two esteemed panelists today. First, Sean Dixon has been the Executive Director of the Puget Soundkeeper Alliance since 2021. The Soundkeeper Alliance's mission is to protect and enhance the waters of Puget Sound. Sean has an extensive background in environmental law, policy, and science. He holds law degrees from Pace University, a master's degree from the Yale School of the Environment, and a bachelor's degree in marine biology and oceanography from Boston University. He is active in leadership for ABA SEER and has been on the adjunct faculty at Yale College, Pace Law School, and Clarkson University. Dr. Greg Evans is a member of the faculty at the Chemical Engineering and Applied Chemistry Department of the University of Toronto. His research interests include urban air pollution, specifically traffic-related air pollution, and particle emission from brakes and tires. He is also director of the Southern Ontario Centre for Atmospheric and Aerosol Research, also known as SOCAR, and the director of the Institute for Studies in Transdisciplinary Engineering Education and Practice, aka ISTEP. Greg has a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Toronto. As for your moderator, my name is Jack Lyman, and I'm a partner at Martin Law, LLP in the Washington, D.C. office. Martin is an environmental and energy law boutique headquartered in Seattle. My practice focuses on regulatory compliance, particularly in the transportation sector, and I'm also co-chair of SEER's Science and Technology Committee. So, in case you hadn't read the episode description yet, you might be wondering what a waterkeeper and a chemistry professor who researches vehicle emissions will have to talk about today. Well, today's focus is on emerging contaminants from motor vehicles. We've known about exhaust or tailpipe emissions from vehicles for decades, and in the United States, these emissions are regulated by EPA, DOT, and in some cases, the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. EPA sets standards for pollutants like carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, or NOx, and particulate matter, or PM. More recently, EPA has also set standards for greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide that are emitted from vehicle tailpipes. Separately, US DOT, through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, sets fuel economy standards that also have the effect of controlling exhaust emissions. These regulations have been pretty successful at reducing tailpipe emissions from gas and diesel vehicles, especially of particulate matter. And I encourage you to check out some studies on the topic, and we'll link to one or two in the podcast description. So, where does that leave us? Tailpipe emissions are declining, and that's great, but it's not the entire story because there are other emissions associated with driving, and this is true whether you're driving an electric car or a gas car. Brakes and tires emit particulate matter and heavy metals as they wear, especially during periods of acceleration and deceleration. As your tires wear, they also shed microplastics and the chemical 6-PPD, which is used in tires to prevent degradation. The emitted 6-PPD then reacts with ozone in the air to form something called 6-PPD quinone. Finally, driving also kicks up road dust into the air. So, with that introduction aside, I'm going to start the discussion with our panelists here. And my first question is for Greg. So, Greg, how do EVs and traditional internal combustion engines compare when it comes to non-tailpipe emissions?
Thank you, Jack, for the introduction, and great to be with you, Sean, to discuss this important topic. And I also want to thank our listeners for being engaged in this area as well. There is going to be a big transition. We hope that'll happen fairly rapidly towards electric vehicles, but internal combustion engines or ICE vehicles are going to be with us for a while. And Because of both of these, we're interested in how much is being emitted, not just from the tailpipes, but from the brakes and the tires of vehicles. So tailpipe emissions come when a vehicle accelerates or puts on the brakes or corners. This is where we get the abrasion going on. And the basic story is that the heavier the vehicle, the more abrasion you'll get. And so the more wear you'll get on the brakes when you apply them, the more wear you'll get on the tires. We all know that we replace our brakes and tires and really don't pay a lot of attention thinking about where did all that material go. Well, frankly, we know it went into the environment. Some of it becomes airborne and some of it goes into waterways. And some of it ends up as the dust on the road itself that then gets resuspended by the vehicles. Now, I say there's a lot of it. It actually surprises me how much. So a typical car will emit about half a pound of dust per year from its brakes, which is a surprising amount. Trucks, far more. They're heavier. It's about 6 pounds a year, depending on their size. And when you add that up, you get basically hundreds of thousands of tons of particles being emitted to the air we breathe across the US, and a value about 10 times smaller here in Canada as well. So that's a substantial amount of material. The challenge for electric vehicles is that they're heavier, and so their weight is more comparable to a pickup truck or an SUV. So a sedan electric vehicle has that extra weight because of the batteries, about 1,000 pounds heavier or 20% heavier, and hence they emit more. The place that that's more evident is in the tires. I love electric vehicles. I've been driving electric vehicles for many years now. We have not been to a gas station for an awful long time. But I do know we go through the tires quicker than we used to. So that is a real issue. The heavier vehicle is wearing more. Brakes, the story is a little more complicated because of the regenerative braking, where when you slow down in a hybrid or electric vehicle, much of the energy goes back to your battery. It doesn't go to friction. And so the sense is that brake emissions may actually drop as we go towards electrification. So we are very interested in the tires. We're interested in the brakes because of the time it's going to undergo this transition. But we can expect that it's not going to be that if we switch to electric vehicles, as much as I love them, that all the emissions are going to be gone.
Thank you, Greg. That's a great explanation. The interaction between EVs, the pros and cons, as you said, of EVs. Sean, I want to turn to you now. I mentioned 6-PPDQ, and I know you and your group have done a lot of work in that area. Could you describe for us a little bit some of the health and environmental effects of 6-PPDQ?
Sure, yeah, and I think that it's good to kind of balance the tires and the brakes conversation. So moving from the brakes and everything that falls off them, and I didn't know how many hundreds of thousands of tons. That's scary, Greg. I wonder where it all runs off to. Hey, what local waterways? Yeah, well, 6-PPDQ is a tire problem. So this is moving into from the brakes into the tires. Got your EVs are just a nice fancy air-conditioned box and everything on the inside works magically well, but you still have these brakes and tires on the outside. And so that's kind of where conceptually we are right now with looking at the environmental impacts of these emerging contaminants. But 6-PPDQ, just to take a step back, is our understanding of it is emergent, but it's been around and been in every tire on the planet since the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s. So 6-PPD is what is added to the rubber of a tire, anywhere between 1% and 3% by weight, sometimes a little higher than that for larger trucks. Of the tire itself is 6-PPD, which is generally made by only a few manufacturing companies across the planet, but it was designed to stop rubber from degrading. So that's absolutely critical to the safety of a tire. So that 6-PPD, when it interacts with ozone on the side of the tire, or when those tire wear particles are out in the environment, turns into 6-PPDQ. And this is an emerging issue because we really had been tracking in the world what was causing things like stormwater mortality of salmon, but we didn't really know why until some researchers in 2020 at the University of Washington State Stormwater Center and EPA researchers, NOAA researchers, a giant lab group came together and finished a kind of a 10-year assessment tracking down where all this stuff was coming from, killing these salmon in our local waterways from stormwater runoff. And it turns out it was an as yet undescribed chemical called 6-PBDQ, so 6-PBDQ. And 6-PBDQ is the substance that 6-PBD breaks down into, and it has some pretty intense environmental effects. So a lot of folks know about our normal tailpipe emissions causing climate change, and there's all the heavy metals that are in the air. You're breathing stuff. It's why we have catalytic converters, why we have exhaust pipes, you have air controls, everything that you said at the start. But a lot of this, a lot of car management hasn't ever looked at water and receiving waters and things like that before. And this is a relatively emerging area. 6-PBDQ started as an environmental investigation into salmon mortality. So the first environmental effect of 6-PBDQ is that it is the second most toxic substance to an aquatic life known to science. And that means it's pretty bad at really, really, really extremely low levels, parts per trillion lows. It can kill any coho salmon that it comes into contact with, 100% mortality. So it'll just kill them straight up. 6-PBDQ, it makes the barrier between their blood and their brains ooze in between one another. It makes them swim in circles. It kills them. And this is why it's environmentally horrible, is that it kills them a lot of times before they have a chance to spawn. So we have all these returning salmon that come back to our streams and rivers and creeks after several years at sea, and they need about 3,000 eggs need to be laid for every 2 salmon coming back. So we need a huge, healthy returning population. The minute they get hit with even levels as low as 10 parts per trillion, they're going to die. There's a near certain chance that they're going to die. The other thing is sublethal mortality. It's just starting to be studied. And so early studies in sublethal mortality of fish are showing that when exposed to 6-PBD and 6-PBDQ, both, a lot of the salmon that have been looked at have, their eyesight is poorer, their muscle mass is smaller, they're less able to survive in the ecosystem moving forward from exposure to this when they're young, as they're out migrating and as they're growing. So it's not just a coho problem either. It's been found to affect brook trout, rainbow trout, Chinook salmon at higher levels, but still affected by this. There is acute lethality at environmental scale concentrations for all those other fish. And so this is a problem that started as an environmental issue in the Pacific Northwest, but it really affects salmonins and a couple other species across all of North America and beyond. So that's just some of the early environmental effects. Again, this chemical was only kind of landed on our sonars in 2021, 2020. But then, there's emerging research into its health impacts. And there's been a couple studies recently that show 6-PBDQ in people's lungs there's connections between pathways for cancer growth. There have been, conversations and papers published about 6-PBDQ limiting photosynthesis and marine algae, which should scare everybody that needs to breathe oxygen. So we're just kind of discovering some of the more cascading levels of impacts from this chemical that is ubiquitous. It's in every tire on the planet, electric, gas, bicycle, bus. It's in the tires that are in those giant trucks in strip mines that are moving boulders. It's in the tires on those like little scooters that you ride everywhere. It's everywhere. It's a huge, huge problem.
Thank you, Sean. I want to make 2 quick points. First, I appreciate someone in your position using sonar. It's on our sonar instead of it's on our radar. If you didn't catch that, I encourage you to rewind. So thank you, Sean, for that. And the second more substantive point I wanted to make is you mentioned the Pacific Northwest, obviously, and the impacts to other sort of media. What about salmon in other places? I just returned from the United Kingdom where there's a lot of salmon. What about effects of North Sea salmon or Atlantic salmon on the other side of the Atlantic?
It's a great question, and I think that's where the research is growing exponentially right now. That's to look at other species and how they're affected. The acute mortality has been discovered to be limited to certain, maybe 5 or so fish species. Coho, the worst of all, but there is all of this sublethal impact that's going on. And a lot of the species that are affected, the trout species, are extant in across kind of the northern hemisphere. There are salmon populations just about everywhere, or salmonids, or trouts, or things like that are affected by 6PB and 6PQ. And it's really, the Pacific Northwest is just where we started noticing this pre-spawn mortality, urban runoff mortality syndrome, starting in the 90s, a little bit earlier actually. And so some early investigation. My organization does kind of community science efforts around here, tracking some of this mortality. And Longfellow Creek, a hotly studied creek here in Seattle. That's kind of where a lot of the research that led to this originated from. But this has been it's been an ongoing mystery because we are so inundated with salmon here around the Pacific Northwest. But like I said, it's a question that we've heard come up when people are looking at trout populations in fly fishing streams far upriver from the Susquehanna and Pennsylvania waters, where there's economies that are based on trout fishing, and there's roads that don't have any sort of stormwater management, leading to lots of tire wear particles falling into rivers that have species of trout that are affected by this chemical with acute mortality, sublethal mortality. And so we're connecting the dots kind of in every corner of our global watershed.
Okay, thanks. I want to turn back to Greg for a moment now. Greg, I understand, as I mentioned at the top, you're a professor, a researcher at the University of Toronto, and I understand you're working on a paper now in this area. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now?
Yeah, I'm always very happy to discuss the research that we're involved in. Let me preface that by saying I think I misspoke when I said couple 100,000 tons a year from brakes. That's actually brakes and tires, but I want to emphasize that's just what's going into the air we breathe, and the particle sizes that we can breathe it. There's more that ends up on the road and ends up in the waterways. And as Sean was describing, he was describing 6-ppd, 6-ppdq. These particles, whether they come from the brakes and tires, are pretty complex chemical mixtures. They're a real soup of compounds. And so, for example, in the brakes, we used to have asbestos in our brake pads. Fortunately, that's been phased out, but only very recently. The issue now is copper. Copper's added there, but has been found to be having toxic effects on fish. So once again, fish are sort of being our marker of potential hazards. And so that is starting to be phased out as well. But there's many, many other chemicals in there. Brakes are surprisingly complicated chemistry. We're interested in trying to support regulations to change the emissions, find ways to mitigate the emissions, changes to the technology, for example. How do you make brake pads? How do you change tires? And one of the really important questions there is how it's impacting human health. So certainly impact on the ecosystem is very important as well, but sometimes regulators want evidence about how it's affecting us as well. And we just don't know enough there. 6-ppd, 6-ppdq, I think, yes, we do have an idea that we are likely being exposed to it if we live near major roadways or busy roads, and many of us do live relatively close to major roads, but we don't really know yet if that's having effects on humans. We can suggest it based on what's happened to wildlife, but we don't know. And one of the big steps for that is figuring out how much we're all actually exposed to. So with each breath we take, how much are we taking in if we're standing beside a roadway, for example? That's the first step that's needed in order to understand the impacts on human health, because that information allows us to do the studies of the epidemiology, which requires very large populations, or toxicology as well. So we're very involved in doing that exposure assessment. And we've just are completing, we've got 6 months to go on a 3-year program that was funded by the U.S. Health Effects Institute, where we threw basically every tool we had in terms of trying to assess and monitor the air that we breathe in cities to try to tease out the signal from the brakes and the tires. And really, it's the question of, will we have the tools to be able to figure out how much people are being exposed to? The challenge is that wherever you find a get exposure to brakes and tires, you're also getting exposure to tailpipe emissions. And so separating out those two is a challenge. It'll also support strategies for mitigation once we figure that out. So the ways we're doing it, and this is with a fantastic team of postdocs and students and undergraduate students, is we've set up sites across, primarily focusing on Toronto. It's a large city, but it's pretty well characterized. We know it well. We've studied quite a bit. So we put up what we call fixed sites. We put up sites where we put instruments to collect airborne particles. We can analyze their chemistry. We put up 40 of these across Toronto, and then we just studied it in the fall, in the winter, and in the summer. We also used a network of less expensive air quality sensors, because that's the way that many cities are moving in order to be able to assess air quality, to see how can we use this to provide insight in terms of the non-tailpipe. Another tool we use is called mobile monitoring. Basically, we're driving around in cars, sampling the air, so that way we can cover a large part of the city. And for these studies, we drove about 10,000 kilometers. I say we. It's not quite honest. It wasn't me. It was the fabulous group of researchers doing all this, and doing it during winter as well, which wasn't actually that harsh a winter in Toronto when we did it, but it does complicate things. One of the twists we do is we are sampling as we're driving around, both from the window, so we can get an idea what people are breathing when they're on the road or beside the road, but also from the wheel wells of the cars, to try to get a much more direct indication of what's coming off the brakes and the tires and the resuspended road dust.
Mhm.
We take these samples back to our labs, and we throw lots of instruments with long, complicated acronyms, but basically mass spectrometry, X-ray fluorescence, to look at the chemical composition. We also set up these instruments in both Toronto and Vancouver, and we analyzed for a year, where we could get very detailed information on one location. So the goal there was, we had the fixed sites and the mobile monitoring to describe what we call the spatial coverage, try to cover a city. And then we have these fixed sites with really nice instruments to do the variations over time. See, are weekends different than weekdays? Is morning rush hour different than evening rush hour? Is winter different than summer? We then throw the statistics at it. Lots of machine learning. One of the tools we use is called positive matrix factorization, yet another long acronym. But what it does is it looks at the chemical composition. We'll put in the composition of, say, 25 different compounds. And from that, we can unravel and say, this much is coming from the tailpipe, this much is coming from the brakes, this much is coming from the tires, this much is being blown into the city from upwind refineries or coal plants or that sort of thing. So we can apportion it out. We did those studies in Toronto and Vancouver. And then the last one is, we have data for 40 sites, or where we drove, but we're really interested in the whole city. So we use tools to extrapolate from the places we measured to all the other places, based upon what sort of land use is prevalent. So for example, if we sampled in a park and we got this value, then we'll say, well, likely other parks across the city have this value. If we sample beside a roadway, we'll say sites beside a similar type of roadway. So we use that to extrapolate using these statistical tools. We end up with maps showing how much variation there is across the city. Lastly, we did lab-based work. At this point, maybe regretting asking a researcher to describe his research.
Please continue.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I am enthusiastic about it. We got tire samples. We got used tire samples, new tire samples, and we analyzed them in the lab to look at the composition in terms of things like 6-ppd, 6-ppdq, all the other things that they throw in there. And we looked at it for different sizes and compare the new and the old tires. And yes, the 6-ppd it's sacrificial in that it's an antioxidant. Its goal is to react with the ozone, so it depletes over time. So as the tire gets older, you have less and less of it. But we also see it looks like it's concentrating on the surface of the tires, which we didn't expect to see. And the other thing we didn't expect to see is that we got higher concentrations, quite a bit higher, the smaller the particle size. And that was a bit of a puzzle because, the tire has a certain composition. We thought, well, the tires are just getting worn, so all the particles should be the same. They're coming from the tire. So we're trying to sort that one out as well. That has implications because particles that are smaller, when we breathe them, tend to have more impact.
Mhm.
So it's been a very intense 3 years. And as a follow-up, there is a program that I'll be co-leading with colleagues in the UK and Europe who've also started working on this. It's called Nexus, a sneak preview. We're going to launch this in September. We've got the funding. I'm not sure if I should have said that, but hopefully this will come out after September.
You heard it here first.
You heard it first. That's right. Sneak preview. So we've got 19 universities, a number of industries, and this is to create a network to look at non-tailpipe emissions, really across North America, UK, Europe, and we have some partners in Asia as well, trying to bring people together because this is very much a global issue of current concern, and we need to have some collaborations, particularly to understand the health impacts that may be arising from this. So really enthusiastic, looking forward to be able to work with all these wonderful people and see if we can come up with this knowledge we need to support the development of appropriate regulations.
And Greg, if you need me to drive from Seattle to Toronto with my windows down, for science, you just let me know, and because I think the thing missing there was a long road trip, right? The exposure on long road trips. So just let me know. I'll gladly do that for science. Let me know.
I'll let you know. We'll probably have to do a bunch of medical testing on you before you leave, and when you arrive, we can see the transition. But I appreciate you being official lamb for research. That's
Fantastic. Thank you both. Yeah, Greg, that was a great overview of what you all are working on. And I had a couple of follow-up questions. One thing I was thinking about is these seem to be natural experiments in the field. Is there any way you can tease out any areas where you're testing that have more EVs or more ICE vehicles where you can see more directly the differences between the two? Or do you just have to kind of extrapolate from what you know?
Yeah, we are not able yet to be able to do that. We do have two students, wonderful undergraduate students who may be doing this as we speak because they're probably out there beside the roadways, and they're at stoplights and they're making measurements as cars brake, and they are recording which of the EVs and which of the other types of trucks. I think a better experiment would be to go to Norway and
Yeah.
really see the differences there. But yeah, we don't have a high enough percentage of EVs. We're doing pretty well in Canada, but we don't have a high enough percentage to be able to make those differentiations yet.
Well, I think one thing that leads to is another thing that we've heard right from the start of the awareness of 6PBDQ, at least, which is, there was this one presentation from an association that works on this kind of issue from the industrial side, and they were saying, hey, driver behavior matters. If you're braking real fast, if you're you're in a parking lot and you run over the curbs and you're doing it a lot, that's shaving off so much of your tire each time, and that's kicking up some stuff with your brakes. While I tend to not like the idea of it's the consumer's fault, I think that is part of the puzzle here, which is, how are our streets designed? Are the lights long enough to allow normal braking? Are the view sheds? Are the drivers, their ability to see upcoming stop signs going to allow them to, brake in a normal time? Also, how roads are designed. If they're on hills, usually they've got a little bit more abrasion to help with friction, and so that's wearing down tires faster. So it's consumers, it's transportation, paving systems and parking lot design and curb cuts, and it's transportation and city design, and how much are your cars braking and going and stopping and starting. These are a lot of the same conversations that we've had about GHGs and other kind of air emissions traditionally, that are now kind of super relevant to brakes and tire conversations, because all this stuff gets kicked out from our brakes and tires in kind of the same way. So it's about what's going into the tires and brakes, how they're being used, and how our systems are designed. All of those things are kind of the toxic soup here.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I agree completely. It should not be put on the consumer to say that you're responsible for this. At the same time, there are limits. So some of our earlier research, we showed that it's a very small percentage of the vehicles on the road that produce most of the emissions. So it's poorly maintained vehicles, trucks that have had their filtration system bypassed or jimmied, so the treatment systems are not there. And we've done this. We have a system where, as vehicles drive by our lab, we can measure the emissions from each and every one of them. So we've measured hundreds of thousands of vehicles as we go by, and we can say, yes, it's a small percentage. The more extreme case is the obvious one of, please don't do donuts in parking lots. It's really, or don't slam on the brakes. If we, drive moderately, it can make a big difference. That's right. So there is, to a point, certainly, the urban design is important, the way things are manufactured is important, but there is some responsibility on us as individuals as well to behave appropriately.
Yeah, and that makes me think also of going back to fuel economy and the original sort of vehicles regulation of, when EPA is testing these things, it's my understanding that they're driving a certain way, right? And they're braking a certain way to measure emissions from the tailpipe. And more aggressive driving means more emissions from the tailpipe. And now we know also that it means, more non-tailpipe emissions. So thank you for completing that circle for us, Greg. Another question I had, you had mentioned the mobile sensors that you have in the vehicles and then the fixed sensors that are more discerning. Have you noticed a trend, or what's the trend between the distance between those fixed sensors and the roadway? And by that I mean, do you have them sort of on the curb or on the other side of the sidewalk, or how far are we talking here?
Some of them, it's a great question. Some of them are right on the roadway, and in a few locations we have a gradient study so that we have them at different distances from the roadway, which we've done in the past. A rule of thumb, it depends on how hard the wind is blowing, but it's basically the concentrations have in about 150 to 200 meters, or yards, I should say, I guess, for this audience. It takes a while for it to drop down. We can see when you're downwind of a highway, for example, so the wind is blowing from the highway towards you, we can still see the concentrations high after about 300 meters. In Toronto, the way Toronto was designed was British marching trails, and they were, I think it was 100 chains apart. There's a useful unit that nobody uses anymore, but that means about 600 meters, which means that once you get 300 meters away from one major road, you're starting to get closer to the next major road. It's very hard to get further than 300 meters away from a major road in Toronto, and I think that's true of many cities. So we're all being impacted to some degree because of these emissions coming from the roadways.
And those are just the air emissions. They're not the emissions that end up on the road and in the sewers and in the waterways, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Another question I have, gosh, no, it was fascinating to hear you describe the study, and I'm wondering about, you mentioned your lab test. Do you all have a dynamometer or access to that, or are you measuring tires sort of in motion at different speeds, or how are you doing that?
Our focus is very much field measurements. There's a surprising amount of information already on lab-based measurements of brakes and tires, because that you can do a controlled experiment. You can put something on a dynamometer and do tests that way. Extrapolate to what actually happens in the field with people driving the way they actually drive is the question. Because of that, it was hard for us to generate particles from these tires, and we tried all sorts of ways of creating particles that are small enough for our measurement systems, which are the really small particles, the ones that get deep in our lungs. I won't go into all the many ways we've done it, but using a Dremel is one way that we are able to create a lot of tire dust in the lab. It's not the ideal way, but it's a way that allows us to test many different samples of tires.
But a Dremel is what I use to trim the nails on my dogs. Are we talking about the same thing?
Yes,
Okay.
we are, but I had never heard about them using to trim the nails on the dogs.
instead of the clippers, some dogs can be scared of the clippers, but the Dremel can just sort of rub it down, and there's a lot of dust that comes out of it.
Yeah.
So anyway,
That's a different podcast.
yeah, yeah.
Get at that.
Make a note of that one. Yes.
And my last question for both of you guys, I mean, we can start with Greg though, is within SEER and ABA, we're talking a lot about artificial intelligence these days and its applications in research and in the environmental context. And Greg, are you all using AI in any way in sort of this kind of predictive modeling or extrapolating that you're doing? And then Sean, have you used AI in your work?
So when people say AI, I think they're often talking about generative AI, things like
Right. Yeah.
the idea of it's a probabilistic fill in the sentence sort of approach. We're working with large data sets, so we tend to use different machine learning tools for looking at associations. So we try to merge that with physical understanding. The problem with machine learning is that you can come up with some very strong associations, but you don't really know why. So it's a bit of a black box of the statistics that you can throw at it. So you can show these are related, but then you need to go back and figure out, why are they related? Why are we seeing an increase of this metal under this conditions, or why is it different in winter than it is in summer? But for doing literature searches, etc., there's some very powerful tools out there that can help scan through the massive amount of literature that's out there. So we're seeing more and more of that.
Thanks. And then Sean.
From my standpoint, there's I think one of the first searches I did on ChatGPT was how many bottles of water did it take for you to do this search because of cooling at your data set.
Yes.
And then it returns a pretty decent answer that's well researched. Of course, you may or may not believe it, but I try to limit that what I'm using, because I think this is another emerging field, right? And the Puget Soundkeeper Alliance is one of the founding members of the Global Waterkeeper Alliance, and so we've got sister organizations, about 300 of them across the planet, 180 in the U.S. alone. In many watersheds where listeners might be right now, there's probably a group like mine with 30 or fewer staff. Most of them are 10 or fewer staff that are just getting people out to learn about their waterways, clean up, defend, protect, restore watersheds. And in a lot of those watersheds, massive data centers are going in, massive uses of server farms. And, the minerals needed to build those server farms, the land use taken up by those server farms, the air emissions, the heating, the gas turbines, the cooling water, all of those impacts, I think we regularly talk about here. Just bringing it back to tires and brakes. Maybe we don't slam on your brakes. We should put the brakes on them softly so we're not creating air emissions and ruining local, ecosystems in the water. But, it's this same question here on AI. Are we using this stuff too fast, too furiously, and it's creating kind of these unintended consequences? And I'd say a lot of places the answer is yes at the moment, because I hate to, again, put it on the consumers, but how many times are we going to type into some search engine, give me a fancy picture of a clown on top of a pyramid? That information's flying around all of the planet Earth, multiple satellites landing inside of 6 different server farms, turning on 7 switches, and all sorts of other technology words that I don't know and I shouldn't speak to. But, that's getting back to some fancy picture of a clown sitting on a pyramid. And then you just move on past that in your life and the impact's done. But, cumulatively, those tons of copper that build up across, our air sheds in our cities, the tons of water used to cool server farms, the stuff adds up. And so it's a really interesting, corollary to brakes and auto emissions. It almost everything in sustainability comes back to how are we using things? What is the best use? What is the most protective and efficient way that we're doing something that balances harms with, utility? Our ability to take things like machine learning to apply them to huge data sets, fantastic. Great use of that information and technology. Our ability to take that stuff and make a fancy, animation, maybe not the best use of stuff. And so the question is just the same as cars. It's like, where is the balance? Is most of what we're using AI for in the first box, or is it most of it in the latter box? And how do we regulate moving forward all these kind of varying industries as these emerging things, pop up into the world? How do we stay ahead of their impact to make sure that we're keeping our planet and its people safe?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think the most recent number I've seen for a chat GPT or a Copilot search is sort of 4 watt hours, which doesn't seem like a lot. You do one search, it's like leaving one of the bulbs in your room on for an hour. It's not a lot, but then if you do a lot of searches, it really adds up. And there is, a challenge in that the barn door is open, the horse is gone. People are going to be using AI for all sorts of things. And so it really comes a question of how can we generate the needed power in a very sustainable way? We got to accept that there is going to be this demand on electricity with consequential environmental impacts unless we do it in the right way. And that's something we need to decide on now because it takes a long time to put out energy infrastructure in place. So it's an important issue. I did want to suggest to people a couple things that they may be able to do. Many of us don't pay much attention to the filter that we have in our cars. Hopefully an electric car, but any sort of car, and that there's different qualities of filters that filters the air that comes from outside and comes into our vehicle. And think about that next time you get it serviced, get a better quality filter. It really depends what you're driving behind. It's hard to tell a high emitting vehicle. You can't necessarily see it visibly. It's not always just the ones that are emitting black smoke, so you really don't know what's coming at you. In Canada, that's particularly a problem in winter where we need to have fresh air going onto our windscreens in order to keep them defrosted. So you really don't have the choice of putting the recirculation mode on. The other one to think about is these antioxidants in rubber are many other places other than vehicle tires. A recent study I saw was on the soles of climbing shoes for indoor gyms. So indoor climbing gyms, those soles have to be very soft because that's how you get a good grip. And yes, the concentrations found in these climbing gyms of 6 ppd were higher. Other ones are tires at playgrounds or artificial turf at sports field. So there's a number of places where we may be getting exposed that we don't know about yet, and all of these need to be researched as well.
Yeah, the data coming out of Europe, I think in an early California assessment that was looking at tires showed that a soccer field or football pitch, if depending on where you're listening from, takes 25 to 30,000 tires to crumb up in order to get a pitch to be pretty springy. So these are concerns across the spectrum here, and I think that that's where a lot of the management of some of these problems turns to solutions. How are there alternatives for soccer fields? Yes, there are definitely alternatives. Grass. And for tire swings, are there alternatives? Yes, there's alternatives. Climbing gyms, maybe not. Is that a question of air filtration, safety inside the climbing gyms? But for roadways, looking at things like copper, looking at things like 6PB and 6PBQ, that kind of buried the lead at the start talking about 6PBQ. A corollary study released when they discovered 6PBQ or first described it, showed that it is entirely mitigated if you filter stormwater through green infrastructure. So we actually have a 100% solution to this, which is there's a whole bunch of different mediates that you can have for like a rain garden or a bioswale. As long as you're disconnecting storm drains and storm pipes from receiving waters by filtering it through bioinfiltration media, there's tons of different ways to do it that all cut back on the 6PBDQ. It kind of just grabs onto that organic media and then slowly falls apart. So you can protect our salmon streams with green infrastructure. And that's being done all over the country, but not in a way that's designed to address this particular emerging contaminant issue. And so that leads to a lot of legal liabilities because we've got a solution to this problem. But, there's the air emissions and things that Greg's studying. And you may have the world's greatest green infrastructure, but if you've got particulate matter floating over from the highway a half mile away, it's going to go float right over your green infrastructure bioswale and land in your receiving waters as well. So, there's both the need to address this at the small scale, filtering our stormwater, working on it that way, as well as finding the replacement field materials to limit exposure there. And then ultimately finding alternatives to 6PVD for tires that we can hopefully switch in easily and limit some of these ginormous environmental and public health liabilities.
And it's not, just the waterways. So those are excellent points, and certainly the filtration systems for stormwater, drain water. Those are really nice solutions. It's not just the waterways; it's the oceans as well. Suggestions are that tires are if not one of the largest sources of microplastics in the ocean. You may see the water bottles when they come up on the beach, and you think about that as plastic pollution, but actually much of it is too small to see. It's these tiny particles that have come from the tires that are now in the ocean, and perhaps ironically, what will happen is that when they get to the surface, and if you get choppy water, so you get waves, you get whitecaps, that can re-aerosolize them and return them from where they came from, which is perhaps appropriate that we have to deal with it as well.
This has been some great discussion. Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Sean. That is it for today. A reminder to check out the other podcasts in this series and also to consider joining ABA SEER if you're not already a member. Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at americanbar.org/enviro. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.